And this isn't working. Okay, there we go. So my name is Konrad. I'm a resident internal medicine physician. That's one of my trainings. I'm also a licensed dietitian and soon to be a licensed clinical dietitian. I'm a lifestyle coach and vice president of the Romanian Society of Lifestyle Medicine. So we organize congresses and events where we try to educate people and both, lay people and the medical professionals on health topics. Last year's Romanian Society of Lifestyle Medicine Congress, for example, had, I don't know if you've heard of Hans Diehl, Colin Campbell, Caldwell Esselstyn, quite famous names in the field of lifestyle medicine and also dietetics participate, as well as many other speakers, and we had a really good congress. So we're hoping that this year's congress will be the same, and I'm really hoping that you've also benefited a lot from the congress you're participating on at the moment. I was invited to speak at this event because the organizers also wanted kind of a health side to the whole agriculture and diet, basically, well, diet topic. And I chose to talk about a topic which is fairly poorly understood, let me put it that way. And if you're not careful to understand it correctly, you can fall into including scams and different programs that will milk you of your money and not give you very much benefit, or not very much more benefit than an evidence-based nutrition science and medicine approach to how you can actually improve your health. So we're going to be talking about a little bit about detoxing, but the whole topic revolves around toxins. Detoxing, we'll talk about at the end a little bit. So before we get there, we need to define a certain class of toxins which I actually want to focus on, and that's our main subject today. And these are called persistent bioaccumulative toxic substances, or PBTSs as they're known. How many of you have heard of PBTSs? Nobody. Oh, one person. There we go. We have one person who's heard of PBTSs. PBTSs are a very large family, very large group of chemical substances to which all of us are exposed. Even if you are among the healthiest people in the world, you're still exposed to PBTSs. And we know this from certain studies, like one of the PBTSs that was very famous about in the 70s and 80s is a certain pesticide that was highly effective, very highly effective. It really killed what it needed to kill, but it was also quite toxic. It was called DDT. Have any of you heard of DDT? DDT has a 70-year half-life. And by and large in pharmacology, we count 5 half-lives to get rid of about 97–98% of any given substance. So a 70-year half-life times 5 means until this earth gets rid of DDT, we'll probably pass another about 350 years. It's going to take a long time. And studies done on polar bears in the Arctic, I mean polar bears, people don't use DDT up in the Arctic. And even if they did, polar bears are animals that hunt fish and seal and other animals which live in the water. Even polar bear livers have DDT inside of them. So if there's DDT in the livers of polar bears in the far north, where agriculture isn't practiced, then you can bet that most of us will have exposure to similar substances. So the art is to understand what these substances are like, how they behave, and what you can do about it. Basically, PBTSs are substances or chemicals with 3 properties that define them. One of them is that they are toxic, which means that they're damaging to the human body and to other organisms as well. The second is that they're bioaccumulative, which is a very important concept for all of us to understand. And it's one of the concepts that if you understand, you'll be able to clarify for yourself, as well as also maybe clarify for others, why it's not all the same to eat vegetables treated with chemicals or eat farmed industrially farmed animals. Because some people say, oh, well, I might as well eat meat, because I mean, they spray all kinds of things on the vegetables. If you understand the concept of bioaccumulation, you'll be able to understand why it's not all the same, and it's still better to eat pesticide-treated vegetables than farmed animals. You'll understand why soon. And the other property is persistence. So let's define these a little bit better. What does it mean that substances are toxic? When we talk about toxicity, we talk about specific toxicity. Some substances are toxic in one way, but not in another way. So some substances will be neurological toxins, and they'll have neurological toxicity. Others will have reproductive toxicity, meaning that they will lead to decreased sperm count, or they will affect the development of, fetuses.
Can you move for the camera?
Okay, need to move, but then people can't see the screen, and then I'm far away from my laptop, so.
No, it's fine.
Okay, let me see if I can move the whole thing over. Is that better? Okay, so another one is reproductive toxicity, which means that our offspring are affected, or our ability to reproduce is affected. Another one is developmental toxicity. How many of you have heard of developmental programming? How many of you have heard of epigenetics? Okay, more people. Epigenetics is the science that talks about how our genome is programmed. So the genes that we're born with are like a big library, like many, many books. And those books contain information on certain things. Let's take a recipe book for an example. Now, if you have a recipe book and you flip through it and you find a really nice pizza recipe, do you have pizza? No. You have a recipe on how to make pizza. And that's basically the difference between an end product and genes. Genes are recipes on how to make stuff, how to make things. Usually those end products are proteins. Now, let's say that there's certain books in your library which have bad information. They're not beneficial. If you could find a certain way of making those books unreadable, then the information in those books could never be translated into real-life end products. Let's say in your library you have information on how to make bombs and weapons and other things that are not good for humanity generally. What you could do is you could take a safe, take those books, lock them up, and make sure no one can read them. And that power to lock books is called epigenetics. It's the ability to lock up certain genes to make them unreadable for the enzymes which read genes. And basically, by making them unreadable, they'll never be translated. We talk about transcription and translation in genetics, meaning we take a photocopy, we transcribe the information from DNA to RNA, and then we translate the RNA into amino acids which make proteins. And if we can somehow make that whole transcription and reading, transcription, and translation process blocked, then even if we do have the information in our genes, it'll never be expressed. Okay, so basically, developmental toxicity or developmental programming is the science which talks about how a mother's lifestyle programs the epigenetics of her developing fetus. Basically, how you spend your months before and during a pregnancy will program the fetus's genes to be readable or unreadable. So for example, mothers who have a very high calorie, high lipid diet during their pregnancy are more likely to program their fetuses to be predisposed to obesity and type 2 diabetes. Okay, so I hope you get the idea of developmental toxicity, how certain substances will change the way we develop, our offspring develop. Then there's, downright genetic toxicity, which leads to mutations and cancer. Generally, we call these substances carcinogens. And then there are toxins which affect immune function. These are just some. I mean, there'd be a much longer list, but it's not the scope of our presentation to talk about all the ins and outs from a medical perspective. It's more for you to get an idea of what toxic means. And then let's talk about bioaccumulation and some related concepts called bio concentration and biomagnification. This is a very important part for you to understand. Bioaccumulation is a very interesting biological phenomenon found in practically all living organisms. Chemicals which accumulate along the lifespan of any given organism and reach higher and higher levels in the tissues of that organism are bioaccumulative chemicals. And we are particularly interested in fish when we talk about bioaccumulation, and you'll see why very soon. Now, basically these three terms we really break down into two groups, bioaccumulation and bio concentration. The difference between the two is that one happens on dry land and the other one happens in water, but basically the concept, the baseline concept for bioaccumulation and bioconcentration are the same. And then what we call biomagnification. So let's take this diagram and I'll walk you through step by step in what happens during bioaccumulation and biomagnification. The bottom of the ladder, I mean it's at the top of the picture, but it's the bottom of the ladder or the bottom of the pyramid, starts with human activities. Many of these substances we're exposed to are the direct result of our own activities, be it household domestic activities or industrial urban activities. What happens is we produce certain substances which basically end up in one way or another in what we call the phreatic system or the water systems within the ground. Now, most urban areas and rural areas in developed countries have some form of sewage systems where we try to collect sewage and we filter it and we try and make sure that the water that comes out at the end is as pure as possible. However, this doesn't happen everywhere in the world. There are countries in the world where companies and factories directly pump chemical-laden water into rivers, and one of the dirtiest rivers actually is a river in Indonesia. I don't remember what the river is called, unfortunately, and the locals say that depending on what day of the week it is, the color of the river changes. Sometimes it's black, sometimes it's yellow, sometimes it's green, because up the river a number of textile factories have their locations, and they use dyes. And so they dye different clothes, different colors, and instead of filtering the dyes out of the water, many of which are toxic substances, they just pump straight into the river, and then the whole river is colored by these dyes. And people in the area are relatively sick because they're constantly exposed to high levels of mercury and other heavy metals. So basically, be it ethical or unethical industrial activities, we end up with chemicals which then get into the water in the land or straight into rivers and eventually ends up in seas and then oceans. And over the last few decades, and I probably can already say over the past 100 and some years since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen higher and higher levels of certain substances accumulating in the waters of the ocean. Now, practically, the difference between, let's say, what the level would have been 150 years ago to now, if you were to measure it, is not such a huge difference for it to maybe bother you if you saw it on paper. The problem really is bioaccumulation. What happens is that these substances get in the water, and then the phytoplankton, so the plants living in these small, almost you could say one-cell organism, plant organisms which live in the water, they accumulate some of these substances in their bodies, in their cells, and they start concentrating them. Then you get the phytoplankton eating little animals called zooplankton. Now the zooplankton, how much phytoplankton does a zooplankton need to eat during a day, during a week, during a year, or for however long it lives? Well, a certain amount. Now the phytoplankton has already concentrated the substances that are found in the water, and so the zooplankton will undoubtedly get much higher concentrations compared with the water. Then you get the small predators coming along like herring, which eat zooplankton. How many zooplankton does a herring need to eat per day, per week, per month, per year to survive? Well, quite a lot. But the zooplankton already has a lot more of these chemicals than the phytoplankton or the water had. Then you get the middle-sized predators like salmon, which eat herring, and the meat of the herring will have much higher concentrations compared to the water. The salmon will then concentrate even further because salmon live a few years and they eat lots of fish which are already more concentrated in these substances. And then you get the large predators like sharks, like what you see here, orcas, certain whales, and so on. And basically what you get is this bioaccumulation and magnification effect. And basically the higher up you eat on the food chain, the more predators you eat, the higher the concentration of these substances will be. This is a similar diagram, a similar idea. So what we get is these plant forms, I should say, of life in the water, which have a certain amount of substances. Then you get the zooplankton, the small predators, middle, and then the big predators, like including tuna. And many people eat tuna. And obviously there's countries where they eat shark, whales, and so on. This problem is such a real problem that a number of years back, the EPA and the FDA, they published this list, and you can find an even bigger list online available of certain fish meats which are so high in mercury, which is a PBTS, that if you're pregnant, you shouldn't eat them at all. So this category, the choices to avoid, are types of fish that have such high levels of mercury that they can actually be phytotoxic and lead to developmental problems in a developing fetus. And you've got things here like king mackerel, marlin, the orange roughy, shark, swordfish, tilefish, big-eye tuna. Then you have what they call good choices, eating 1 serving per week, which has lower concentrations of mercury, but still so high that you shouldn't be having it more than once a week. And then what they call the best choices, which means having 2 to 3 servings a week, which has yet lower levels of mercury, but it still has. From my perspective, if my wife were pregnant, I'd just say avoid fish all of your pregnancy. I mean, I'm not really wanting to increase her mercury intake at all, which leads to neurological developmental disorders in children. And, you know, if we get to this level of education and warning of the general public, you can be sure that the actual problem is very real, because obviously these big organizations, they don't publish things unless it's really necessary, unless there was enough science, enough data to back up these recommendations. And the fact that these recommendations have been made is evidence to the fact that there are real ecological problems which are present and which are there, and they affect human health. Sorry, just a second, let me plug in my laptop so I don't run out of power. Okay. Poftim? Nu, deja am pus. E gata. Who has heard of this brown stuff called fish meal? 1 or 2 people. What's făină de pește? Fish flour or fish meal. What is fish meal? Those of you, do you know who've heard of it?
It's fertilizer, isn't it?
I guess you could call it, it's a kind of fertilizer, yeah? I'll tell you. So, to understand fish meal, you have to start with industrial fish farming. Not before fish farming, industrial fishing. I'm sure some of you have heard about the concept of trawler fishing, where these really big, powerful boats, they let down very, very long nets, and they have systems which can they can decide how deep in the ocean to let the nets. So they let the nets down to a certain depth, then they let the motors go, and they start what they call trawling, which means with all nets open, they just start going in a certain direction for a number of kilometers. And anything in the way of the nets is picked up. And then after a while, when the nets are full enough, they have big motors on deck which pull everything in. And if the trawler is big enough, they can pull the nets all the way up on deck, and if not, they can just pull them up to the side of the boat and keep the fish that way. Now, what happens with this what we would call aggressive form of fishing is that you catch everything, even what you don't want to catch. You catch big fish, you catch endangered fish, you catch eatable, uneatable fish, you catch small fish which can't be sold. Now, by and large, what they try to do is that fish which are caught, which shouldn't be caught, like dolphins, for example, stingrays and so on, they try to take them out and throw them back in so that they can live on. Whatever can be kept for the industry, like, let's say, salmon or tuna or whatever, is hauled on deck and is kept. You know, they try to kill it, gut it, and then freeze it, because sometimes they might be out for days before they get back to shore, so they have to keep everything frozen. And then the problem is, what happens with all the little fish? Well, when you're talking about tons of fish being, a number of tons of fish being caught with one trawl, you don't have time to catch all the little ones and, you know, throw them back in one by one. So what tends to happen is the industry just keeps these and they dry them. They dry them and then they crush them, they grind them and make fish flour. Then the next issue comes in. Fish flour will already be higher in concentration of PBTSs than the water that the fish were caught in, because of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. And fish flour is generally used in two ways in the animal farming industry. One is to feed fish flour to farmed fish. Now, this is a fish farm, and what you'll see here are these cages or nets, which are inserted into lakes or into the ocean, and sometimes they just have artificially made pools as well at some farms, where they keep lots of fish, and people come by on boats and they throw in different kinds of food for the fish to eat. And one thing that they use is fish meal. And they feed fish meal to fish, including sometimes fish that wouldn't eat such things. And so what you're doing is you're taking already quite PBTS concentrated substances and feeding them to fish again and again and again. So fish-farmed fish might be even higher in PBTSs than wild-caught fish, because of the effect of repeatedly feeding fish meal to these fish. The other direction that fish meal can be used in industry is feeding fish meal to terrestrial animals like cows, sheep, chicken, goats, turkeys, pigs, most of the animals that we farm basically industrially and we slaughter for food. Many of them are fed fish meal, which means that you start to get these unnatural, what should I call them? Cross reactions, maybe? Unnatural cross reactions or crossings between certain levels of the food chain which would never meet with other levels of the food chain, because a normal cow will never eat a fish, or a sheep will never eat a fish. Now, cows would eat grass, which the grass itself would bioaccumulate and magnify certain substances which are used. But when you give them these artificial flours like fish flour, fish meal, you're giving them much higher levels of PBTSs than what would maybe naturally be found in their food. And so many industrially farmed animals, terrestrial animals, will have higher levels of PBTSs in their meat than would normally have been, let's say, 200 years ago, when they were just let loose and they were let to eat whatever they found. Who's heard of feather meal? Nobody. Guess what feather meal is? You've heard. One person's heard of feather meal. Guess what feather meal is?
Same thing as fish meal was made of birds.
Right. When birds are slaughtered in the slaughterhouse, it leaves lots of feathers. Feathers are high in protein, as is fish meal, and that's why it's used. And it makes animals that eat feather meal and fish meal grow faster. Now, there's an interesting thing about chickens, for example. If you give mercury to chickens, chickens have two ways of getting rid of mercury, to detoxify themselves of mercury. One is to put the mercury in the eggs, and the other one is to put the mercury in the feathers. So you see where I'm going with this, right? Now, think about, the industry has made one rule. You can't feed feather meal to chickens, but you can feed feather meals to cows, pigs, not donkeys, sheep, I wanted to say goats, and so on. Now think about it. You could actually technically get animals that are fed both feather meal and fish meal, or one or the other. Another one which I didn't even put on here because there's not enough time and it's next level, it's the feces of chicken can also be reused in industry and fed to other animals. You're not allowed to feed chicken feces to chicken. The industry prohibits it because of diseases which are perpetuated this way, but you can feed it to other animals. So these are the kind of practices that modern farming, industrial farming, is using. And some of you might say, as I often hear in Romania, yeah, but this chicken was grown by so-and-so in a nearby village. And the problem with this is that many local villagers here, and I'm sure in other parts of Europe and the world, they actually go to farming shops and they buy like chicken meal, which is a pre-prepared mix of various things specifically for certain animals to make them grow faster. Now, if this is your argument that, you know, it's okay for me to eat this chicken because an old granny grew this chicken out in I don't know which farm, which is far away from the city, but that granny is coming into the city and buying animal feed from one of the shops in town, the animal feed is highly likely to contain fish meal or feather meal or one of these other ways of getting unnatural things into the food chain of those animals, which will change the quality of the meat of those animals. And basically, from my perspective, I don't think it's necessarily safe to even use these kind of animals if they're grown locally by people who don't have big scale farms, because if they're using the same feed, just buying it from the feed stores, we're not very much better off than before. And these kind of industrial practices are one of the reasons I think that maybe Ellen White wrote that in her time, eating certain animal products was still okay, but there will be a time when it won't be okay. And I'm maybe not necessarily talking about nomadic African tribes that have cows and goats and they wander around and the cows and goats eat whatever plants they can find. Maybe those animal products are a bit healthier and they would fit into the category that Ellen White is talking about in terms of they're still more okay. Even with that, I would have a big discussion with you about cholesterol and saturated fat and arachidonic acid and other things which are in the healthiest of animal products. But Europe and North America and Australia and other developed regions of the world, which very readily available have these different feeds, might already start to fall into that category, the second category of there will come a time when. What's the irony of this whole process of bioaccumulation and biomagnification? The irony is at the end of the picture. Because studies show that the highest levels of certain PBTSs actually go to babies. Why? Because humans have biological organisms too. And how many years does a young woman live eating meat, chicken, beef, fish, etc., dairy products, eggs, and so on, before they have their first child? Well, often they have 2, 3, 3.5, even 4 decades of time to accumulate all kinds of substances in their tissues before they give birth and they have to nurse. In fact, there was a study a few years ago which showed that certain mothers' milk samples had such high levels of certain chemical PBTSs that were they cow's milk, those milk samples, they would be illegal to sell. They had such high levels of toxic substances in them. And so what happens is, this is another example of a PBTS, dioxin. Dioxins are used in farming, so now we're not talking about aquatic life, now we're talking about terrestrial farming. And dioxins are basically used to spray plants in order to protect them from pests. And what happens is some of the dioxins, they remain on the surface of the plants and some of it goes into the ground. and is found in the ground. Cows come along, and grass grown on dioxide treated ground, or oats, grain, what do you call them, corn, other things which are fed to cows, ground and fed to cows, and were treated with dioxins, will already have a certain level that cows will get. And then obviously their dioxin levels will already be higher than what was originally found on or in the plants or the soil. Humans come along and eat beef sandwiches, spaghetti bolognese with beef, beef steak, and many other forms of beef. And they will eat beef repeatedly over a number of years. And so they will bioaccumulate even more of the dioxins. Now, the irony is dioxin is soluble in mother's milk and is found in mother's milk. So who do you think gets the highest concentrations of dioxins? It's going to be the newborn. It's going to be exactly the person that any mother would like to protect. Okay, I hope you understood the concept of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Are we okay? Yeah. Good. So these chemicals, we need to know, these PBTSs, which bioaccumulate and biomagnify, are especially stored in fat tissue. That's a very, very important thing to know. So if you're eating high fat content animal products, like red meats, like lard, butter, matured cheeses, if you're eating things like chicken with the skin on as opposed to with the skin taken off, if you're eating fatty fish as well, the chances of them containing PBTSs are much higher than lean forms which are lower in fat. Mother's milk also has a certain amount of fat, so obviously PBTSs are well soluble in mother's milk. I'd just like to, before I go on, kind of open a parenthesis. Maybe this is one of the reasons why in the Bible God said, don't eat the blood and don't eat the fat. Maybe this is one of the reasons why pork, pigs, is a prohibited form of food. Because by and large, the biology of pigs makes them store lots of fat. And in that fat, you will find higher concentrations of these substances. So one of the arts to being very low in these substances is actually having low fat deposits. It means having good healthy BMI, good healthy body weight, because then you have less space to store this stuff. Some of this stuff actually goes into storage and only comes out when you start to mobilize your fat stores. So if you don't really have very big fat stores, it's very good, because then it doesn't get deposited as well. Now, what does persistent mean? Usually many substances are degraded by sunlight, bacteria, or chemical reactions with other substances. This is what normal biology, normal chemistry, normal physics is like. Chemicals which cannot or do not break down during these normal processes are called persistent. And it's very, very likely that many years, like what I gave you with DDT, will pass before some of these substances will disappear from Earth, even if we stopped using all of them today. Right? We could stop using all the PBTSs we currently produce, and it might still take up to maybe even 1,000 years, depending on the half-life of what the substances are like, for some of them to disappear. And other ones will never really disappear, they just have to recombine. And you'll see why. The chemical structures of these chemicals basically protects them from being broken down by our detoxifying mechanisms. So basically organisms, be it animal or human organisms, can't break these substances down very successfully because of the structure, the chemical structure that they have. Now, some of the examples I could give you are substances containing halogens. And halogens are, I'll show you in a minute on the periodic table of the elements, are a certain class of elements. But some of the worst offenders would be fluor, bromium, and chlorine containing halogen containing substances. Now, metals by definition are persistent because they are elemental materials. So they will never disappear, they just have to recombine. What's not maybe natural about the metals is to find them in such refined forms, like how we've refined mercury and cadmium, lithium, aluminium, lead, and other heavy metals. And because we've found certain uses for these heavy metals, we mine them, we refine them, but that also means that they get out into the environment in high concentrations. Let me give you an example. Maybe a bad example, but I'll give you one anyway, because this is maybe a useful example. I'm sure you've all heard of mercury thermometers. At home, my wife and I, we have 2 electric thermometers, and we had 1 mercury thermometer. And the 2 electric ones broke, and the mercury one was working fine until it got dropped. And then the mercury came out. And it took me, I don't even know how long it took me to collect all the mercury on the bathroom floor. There's a certain way, there's techniques to find it. The human eye normally, even in good lighting, you'll only see some of the bigger, the spheres of mercury. There are ways you can find the tiny, tiny, tiny little ones. And it took me ages to find everything and try to clean out the whole bathroom. Now, are mercury thermometers, or were they a very useful thing in medicine? Well, they were. They were very reliable. And the fact that I have 2 broken electronic ones and a very good mercury one before speaks for itself. And I'm going to be honest with you, as a doctor in the hospital, you can get those electronic, for example, blood pressure meters. They're okay. But when I'm in doubt, I always go back to the classic stethoscope and the inflatable sphygmomanometer, because that's very reliable compared to the electronic ones sometimes. So, was mercury useful in this instance? It was. The problem is when we use these substances for other things and we don't treat the chemicals correctly. Like, for example, we use mercury vapors and other heavy metal vapors in fluorescent lighting. Is lighting good? Well, yeah, it is. It revolutionized the whole world. It changed the way we live. We use lots of heavy metals in batteries. Are batteries good? By and large, yeah, it depends what you use them for. But again, they've made us more efficient and they've opened many doors for doing different things. The problem is when you throw light bulbs and batteries into the city dump rather than recycling them, where they can then degrade and these chemicals can get out in highly concentrated forms. And then the earth, the ecology of the earth needs to find a way to get rid of them. And it takes a very long time for them to recombine and to be able to be incorporated into minerals which they were originally found in, to make them not harmful or, relatively untoxic. So here you have the periodic table of the elements, and what you have over here, all of these are halogens. So it's the column before the noble gases. And then by and large in this area you'll find many of the heavy metals. And some of these are PBTSs in their very concentrated, refined forms. And they're never really going to disappear because they're elements, and elements don't disappear. I mean, unless you threw them in the sun and then because of certain very, very aggressive chemical reactions, the protons would be ripped apart and so on, and they would turn into other elements. I mean, the nucleus would be ripped apart. So, another topic which is very important when we talk about PBTSs is bioavailability. It's not all the same how much you can absorb of what you've eaten, right? That's a very important concept. Now, there was a very good study for this done a few years ago. What they did is they took pork liver, a certain number of grams, and they fed it to participants in the study. They were studying heavy metals, cadmium, lead, and a few others. And they took baseline blood samples and then fed the people the liver, and then took blood samples at time intervals and drew a graphic. They wanted to know if the heavy metal concentrations in the blood changed with time, and they did. Cadmium levels shot up and then started coming down as cadmium was either deposited in different regions of the different tissues and cleared from the blood, or in a certain amount the body was able to get rid of it. Then what they did is they repeated the experiment, took the same quantity of pork liver, but before they fed them the liver, they made them eat leafy green vegetables. And then the liver, and then they did the same thing with the graphic, the blood samples and the graphic. What they found is eating green leafy vegetables blunted heavy metal absorption by about up to 90%. And that was one of the studies that I would say liberated me from the worry of pesticides. So PBTSs are a genuine problem, but if you can find a way to make them unbioavailable, then you can even eat fruits and vegetables and plants treated with certain modern pesticides and chemicals, because as long as you're reducing how much is actually absorbed out of your intestinal tract and whatever isn't absorbed is excreted in the feces, then you're protecting yourself, because technically from a medical perspective, what is in your intestinal tract is not in your body, right? That's a tube with two holes, both of which communicate with the outside world. Technically, what's in your body is what's crossed your gastrointestinal mucous membrane. Once it's past the membrane and gets into the blood, you can really say it's in your body, but before that, it's not technically in your body. So, if you're worried about getting exposure to too many of these chemicals, one thing you can do is eat lots of plant foods, especially leafy green vegetables, and high phytate content foods. All seeds contain phytates, which have the power to chemically bind a lot of these substances and not even allow them to be absorbed.
Can you repeat that?
Phytates, P-H-Y-T-A-T-E, or phytic acid as it's also called. Phytic acid or phytates. And other substances. These are just two that I gave examples of. But there are many substances in plants which will bind these harmful PBTSs and make them unabsorbable, or at least absorbable in very low quantities. Another thing that is important, as I said, is your fat tissue. That's maybe not so much to do with bioavailability. Another factor which you need to consider is what kind of foods you eat and what you combine them with. Because many PBTSs are fat soluble, the more fat and oil you eat, the higher the chance of making them bioavailable, these substances. Oh boy, what's the time? So my question is, do we need to detox? Let's talk a little bit about the physiology of detoxification and elimination. 5 organs are involved in detoxing our body. One is the skin, the second is the gastrointestinal system through the bile and through feces. The third one is the lungs, the fourth one is the liver, and the fifth one are the kidneys. The gastrointestinal system, the whole digestive tract. We don't have time to speak about all of them. One of the most important ones we need to speak about is the liver, so we'll talk a little bit about the liver. Now, if something is not bioavailable, then technically it will just be eliminated by the GI system in the feces. If it gets absorbed, pretty much everything absorbed by the gastrointestinal system, because of the way our anatomy is built, ends up in the liver. So here you have your intestines, and we have a special kind of circulation draining the intestines and the stomach, part of the stomach, and the rectum, called the portal venous system. The portal venous system collects pretty much all the blood from these organs and channels it to the liver. And the liver acts like a filter between the portal venous system and the systemic venous system, which leads to the heart. And it filters out and processes, like a big factory, the substances which come through from the intestinal tract. And the liver has a toolkit, which is basically a collection of enzymes. And using that toolkit, it processes through a lot of substances, including our endogenic normal biological substances which we make, like steroids, steroid hormones, not anabolic steroids necessarily injected externally because of bodybuilding uses, prostaglandins, bile acids, and many other ones. But this same toolkit actually has the power to process what we call xenobiotics. Now, what we call these enzymes in medicine is drug metabolizing enzymes, or DMEs. And these xenobiotic chemicals are defined as chemicals or substances which are foreign to an organism or to a biological system. So anything which shouldn't be there, it doesn't normally belong to the biology of that system or organism, is a xenobiotic. That would include drugs, medicines, carcinogens, pesticides, pollutants, food toxins, and many other things. All of these would be classed as xenobiotics because they wouldn't normally be found in our biological systems. So what DMEs do, what these enzymes do, this toolkit does, is they make substances more hydrophilic, which means that they're easier to dissolve in water. Think about it. Our blood has lots and lots of water, and many of these substances are fat soluble, which makes them very difficult to put in the blood and to try to transport them to one of the organs to get rid of them, because they don't dissolve. So what the liver does is it tries to put them through certain chemical reactions by attaching or detaching certain chemical groups or breaking certain bonds in order to make them more dissolvable in water. Then you can stick them in the blood, and the body can at least try to get rid of them in the urine or the feces, and in some cases by exhaling them. And what they try to do is, if it can't make them fully hydrophilic and non-toxic, then it tries to make them relatively non-toxic. It tries to reduce the toxicity level by attaching chemical groups, which makes the substance less aggressive to the human body. And there are 4 types of reactions. I don't expect you to remember this. I'm just giving you the information so that you see that in medicine we talk about very real processes. They have names, we understand how they work. And when we talk about detoxification processes, these are the things we think about. Oxidation reactions, reduction reactions, hydrolysis reactions, and conjugation reactions. And in pharmacology, we call the first 3 phase 1 reactions, and we call the last one, the conjugation reactions, phase 2 reactions. And they come in that order. First you get the phase 1 reactions, and then the body will apply the phase 2 reactions, the liver. Sorry, I didn't translate that from Romanian. Phase 1 reactions will use a big family of enzymes called the cytochromes, and there's one very famous one called the P450, which is kind of like, how should I put it? He's able to metabolize very, very many different kinds of substances. He's kind of like a metabolism genius. But we also have flavin-containing monooxygenases. Don't have to remember these. I'm just telling you them so that you see that they really exist and we know what they do, and they're very useful. Flavin is actually taken out of riboflavin. Has anyone heard of riboflavin? No? Vitamin B2? Riboflavin, right? Our body needs vitamin B2 in part, not just, but in part for flavin-containing monooxygenases to help us get rid of certain substances. Then we have the monoamine oxidases, and we have the xanthin oxidases and the aldehyde oxidases. So these are the toolkit we work with. Phase 2 reactions use certain chemical substances like glucuronic acid, but the reaction itself is called glucuronidation, where we take glucuronic acid and we attach it to a substance, and the acid makes the whole substance be more eliminatable, let me put it that way. We have sulfonation, methylation, acetylation, amino acid conjugation, and glutathione conjugation. So basically, these are the things we detoxify with. Now, what you have to understand is that these processes are happening 24 hours a day. if they weren't happening, you would probably die in a few days. So coming back to my original question, do we need to detoxify? My answer is no. You don't need to do something special to detoxify. You don't need to do something like do a juice fast once a year for 10 days in order to detoxify. What you do need to do is make sure you have a very good lifestyle every day of the year to constantly keep all of these chemical processes as well equipped with antioxidants and the raw materials that they need in order to do their job. You can't detoxify once a year for 10 days and think that your liver or your kidney or some other organ will somehow magically be able to, I don't know, do something that it can't do normally. We're created for our organs to sustain our life all the time. And that's why I don't believe in detox, I believe in lifestyle. If you want the best detox, just change your lifestyle. You don't need to do juice fasting. Just make sure you're eating enough fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, and avoiding certain high PBTS containing substances or foods. Then there's no reason for you to detoxify. Do we need to detox sometimes from a medical perspective? Yes, but that's a completely different kettle of fish, and I'll show you in a minute. So what happens when we eat substances is a very, very important process which we call ADME. Distribution, metabolism, and excretion. And what happens is, before anything is absorbed, I will finish very soon. I know that it's maybe a difficult presentation to follow. People tell me my presentations are too scientific, but if I don't give enough information, people just end up leaving confused. So I like giving lots of information because then people can clarify why things are the way they are. So liberation means we have to get certain substances out of their natural matrix to make them absorbable, bioabsorbable. Then we have the actual absorption process, which happens in a certain percentage. It's practically never 100%. You always lose a certain percentage in the feces of whatever you eat. We have distribution, which means it's absorbed into the bloodstream and distributed to tissues where it will be metabolized or stored, and then it needs to be excreted in some way or another. And this is a very, very important concept to understand when you talk about, for example, the low-grade inflammation, which is present in a lot of modern chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease, cancer, depression, Alzheimer's disease, and other ones as well. What happens there is actually with a lot of biological substances, we're upholding a certain level of inflammation. Biological substances like arachidonic acid, like trimethylamine oxide, like nu-5-GC, and other pro-inflammatory substances which can be found, many of them, in animal products. What happens? Anytime you eat anything, there's an absorption lag time. So you ate here, but till it gets in your bloodstream, it might take, half an hour, 1 hour, however long it takes to digest and absorb that certain substance. And then if we were to take blood and compare baseline to, let's say, half an hour, then 1 hour, and so on, what we would see is we get this exponential growth in the concentration of that certain substance till you reach a maximal concentration, and then your body starts. Well, it actually starts from here, but because there's a lot more inflow than outflow, concentration goes up. Your body starts to be able to eliminate what you ate, be it a medicine, be it any xenobiotic. It will try to get rid of it. The liver will try to use those enzymes to get rid of it and start to decrease the concentration. And what we talk about is this 50% decrease, what we call the half-life, and then we have the second half-life and the third one and the fourth one, and by the time you get to the fifth one, about 97.5% of the substance is eliminated. That's why we say it takes about 5 half-lives to get rid of something. Now then, if you do this just once with many substances, you'll get a spike, then it goes down, and by and large the concentration won't be that high. Like thinking back to the water example with the phytoplankton. The difference between the concentration in the water and the phytoplankton is nowhere near as big as the water and the sharks. Why? Because of this thing called the therapeutic range, and another thing which I'll tell you about in just a minute. For some of these substances which we eat to be biologically effective and active, you need to reach a certain concentration in your body. And we do this basically with medicine, right? That's why we know how many milligrams of anything we want to give and how often, because we need to give it often enough to eliminate the metabolization and the half-life losses, to make sure we keep the concentration constantly between the minimal effective concentration and the maximum toxic concentration. So beyond this, they're damaging. Below this, they're ineffective. Now, if you do this just once, as I said, it might not affect your biology so much. But what do? Well, we eat here and the concentration goes up, it starts coming down. But then we eat here and the concentration goes up and intercepts this wave and takes it back up again. And then we eat here again. And what you get is this undulating sinusoid curve of blood concentration for certain substances that constantly keeps that substance within the therapeutic or the biologically effective range. And that's what people do when they eat animal products. When they eat meat, dairy products, fish, poultry products like eggs, they constantly keep their cholesterol level, their arachidonic acid level, their trimethylamine oxide level, and so on, in the therapeutic range to keep inflammation going, which will help cancer, atherosclerosis, diabetes, and so on to form and to stay present. And it's the same idea with these PBTSs. If we're constantly eating these animal products which are concentrated in PBTSs, we're constantly keeping these levels high by constantly reintroducing the substance every 4 to 6 hours. You understand what I'm getting at? So it's very important to be balanced. If you eat cheese once a year, this will happen for you once a year. It's not going to be the end of your health. Cheese is high in aluminium. For me, it's very ironic. People who are anti-vaxxers against vaccination, because they say, oh, there's aluminium in vaccines. Well, there's more aluminium in a slice of cheese than in one vaccine. And how many vaccines does a kid get in their lifetime? 10 to 15. How many slices of cheese do they eat in their lifetime? You see the irony? So, in my opinion, maybe stop feeding your kids the cheese and do your research on which vaccines are good and which ones aren't. So what is the concept of detox? I'm entering my last slide. From a medical perspective, detox does exist. And by and large, we use it for the name for a recovery program from a drug or an alcohol addiction. That's what people generally mean when they say, I'm going into detox. And when we think as doctors about detox, that's usually what we think about. Detox as a concept also exists. I'm sorry, my sliding isn't correct. You'll see the things coming in again and again. Is also a medical treatment against certain known and well-defined toxins. Very important, known and well-defined toxins. And usually we have some sort of therapy for them, be it an antitoxin. My brother recently just stepped in a nail this past Sunday. I took him down to the emergency department to get an anti-tetanus vaccine because tetanus toxin is highly lethal. But that's a very well-defined toxin, and we know what the treatment is for it. And we use chelation therapy for heavy metal intoxication, like with mercury or with lead or cadmium. Detox, as a concept, is also the physiological process through which the body transforms certain toxic substances into less toxic or easier to eliminate substances, which I already showed you, like what the liver does. And then the last one, which is the modern, the kind of trendy, the fashionable concept of detox, which is a program with the aim of eliminating not clearly defined toxins from the body using one or more techniques like fasting, green juices, eating lots of fruits and vegetables, doing enemas, and so on. And the fourth one is where you can get your fingers caught. Because if you don't know enough science, you might fall for the concept that you need to detox, the fourth kind of detox. The first three you need to do. These ones you need to do only when you have a clearly defined problem. Either you have a drug addiction or you know you have a heavy metal intoxication. This one you don't need to focus on particularly because your body's doing it all the time. The only way you need to focus on this one is make sure you have an optimal diet and lifestyle every day of the year. And this one's the trap, because what they plant in our minds is you need to detox from chemicals, from substances, but they are not clearly defined. You don't even know what you're what are you detoxing against? That green juice, what is it helping against? I mean, I gave you enzyme names, chemical reactions, I gave you substance names for the other forms of detox. Yet this is kind of ethereal. It's like nowhere. And that's why when I held this presentation last year at a health and family camp, I told them, do you need to detox? My opinion, understanding anatomy and physiology and chemistry and biology is you don't need to do any special kind of detox, like certain kinds of very special fasting and pay lots of money for expensive programs, unless you know you have a clearly defined problem, which means you have a heavy metal intoxication or some other form of intoxication, or you have a drug addiction. What you do need to do is make sure you sustain point number 3 every day of the year. Eat lots of whole grains, nuts and seeds, fruits and vegetables, drink enough water, and just help your body do what it does 24 hours a day anyway. You're not doing something magical by giving it a green juice. If you're eating plenty of salads, plenty of whole grains, which aren't stripped of their oligo-elements and of their phytonutrients, you should be getting most of what you need. Now, don't get me wrong. Can you drink a juice because you like the taste? You want to make a green smoothie with bananas and avocados and spinach? Sure, don't let me stop you. They're quite delicious. But let's not call it what it's not. That's my point. Let's call it what it is. That can be part of a healthy lifestyle, but you don't need to do it 10 days a year to make sure you're detoxing. What you do need to do is make sure you're eating the kind of foods that make your foods low bioavailable. So what can you do? You can obviously wash your fruits and vegetables and foods before you eat them to make sure if there are any pesticides on them, they get washed off. You can avoid certain foods like animal products, which are usually the highest offenders in PBTSs. And the other thing is, make wise food choices. Make sure you're getting enough green leafy vegetables, because we know about those, for example, is that they blunt the bioavailability of PBTSs. Make sure you get enough whole grains, which contain phytates and fiber, which also blunt the bioavailability of PBTSs. And if you're doing that every day of the year, 2 to 3 times a day, depending on how many meals you have, you should be fine. There should be really nothing extra that you should be doing. Just do enough sports, eat a healthy diet, drink enough water, sleep enough, new start. Nothing magical, but people like magical stuff. That's the thing. We like spending. I would rather, sell a kidney and give 1,000 euros or 5,000 euros for a very expensive program and feel like I'm a hero because I'm doing something very ascetic. I'm starving myself and I'm drinking juices for 60 days, rather than do the harder thing, which is to change my life till they put the last nail in my coffin. That's much harder than doing a juice fast once a year for 10 days or 20 days. Because then you can go back and do the things that you know aren't good for you. The other 340 days a year, Okay, I hope you understood my point for today. That's the end of my presentation. I'd like to open the floor for a few questions. It was a very long presentation and I apologize. But if there are any questions, please fire away. First one.
What about the recent studies about high levels of arsenic in rice? Is rice still safe to eat?
Yeah, rice is still safe to eat from my perspective. I mean, if we're talking about arsenic, that problem has been around in almonds for ages. Almonds naturally have high levels of arsenic, which is why you shouldn't be eating more than maybe 7 or 8 almonds a day. And if there is arsenic in the rice that you have, then again, the same bioavailability and the discussion comes in that we had before. Well, if you have other foods like regular vegetable salads which have green leafy vegetables in them, then you're still going to be blunting the absorption of some of these substances. So you should be okay. Now, what's the problem? Should you be having rice every day? That's why we talk so much in nutrition about having a varied diet. Because besides rice, there's so many other things you can eat. There's corn, there's oats, there's rye, there's barley, there's quinoa, there's amaranth, and so on. There's other things that you should be rotating in your diet, and then you should be okay. Welcome. Next question, if there is one. Yeah.
Is there any easy way or quick way to assess if you have a high toxicity
for certain substances? There is. One of the highest ones is to go and get a blood test. So you just get a blood test, and you can get panels of testing for heavy metals, for example. And they'll do lead and mercury and cadmium and lithium and so on. That's one of the easiest ones, but it can be costly.
And what would be the symptoms of, let's say a higher...
Well, that would be, for me, would be very hard to tell you now, because each one can cause different kinds of symptoms. Like, for example, in fully grown adults, if you get very high doses of mercury, you'll get a very quick reaction, usually vomiting. And that's why, any of you heard of heroic medicine? Heroic medicine was the form of medicine practiced in the times of Ellen White. And if you start doing some studying on what practices they were, you understand why she wrote the things she did. In fact, if you understand American history and how after America got its independence in the 1780s, and how America and Europe, they broke their ties for quite a few decades, and the scientific darkness that pervaded in America up until the late 1800s. Ellen White wrote most of what she wrote during the golden age of heroic medicine, from about the 1850s till the end of the 1800s. It was the darkest period for American medicine until Johns Hopkins University and Hospital was formed around 1890. So by the time Johns Hopkins was formed and revolutionized medicine in America, and then a few years later slowly in the world as well, until one of the very important reports was published in the early 1900s, which changed the availability of medical education by closing down a lot of very poor quality medical schools in America. Ellen White was already old by that time. She had written most of what she had written during that time. And one of the things they did in that time was use mercury chloride, so-called calomel, as a form of medicine, which they gave to people, and any self-respecting doctor of the 1800s would never give up on a patient before they tried to purge them with a good dose of calomel. And because it was very high concentrations of mercury, the body reacted very quickly to that high level of toxicity, because we have sensors, toxic substance sensors in our stomach, and they would vomit and they would get diarrhea from it. It would be a laxative, because the GI tract was trying to find any way of getting rid of it as quickly as possible so that as little as possible would be absorbed into the bloodstream. So you can get effects from very acute, very short term, like throwing up and getting diarrhea, to long-term chronic effects, which will only appear much later depending on what your daily concentration is. And with mercury, for example, very often what we will see is neurological problems in fully formed adults who already have a healthy, or who had a healthy neurological system before. But you'd have to take each heavy metal and check, because they don't always overlap, unfortunately. Yeah.
Is there any, what's the risk for vegan people to have
It's much, much lower, unless you live in an area of the world which has higher levels of toxins due to industrial reasons, like living down the river from a very industrialized part of your country where factories may or may not be respecting filtration protocols. Or if you live beside a factory that produces certain fumes which are released into the area, or if you live in a very old building that still has lead plumbing, for example, and you have lead water pipes. That's why, for example, I have a friend in Stuttgart, and she told me that where her mother works, they're not allowed to drink any of the water from the building because that's an old building, it still has lead plumbing, and the lead level of the water is too high.
What about using aluminium pots?
Aluminium is by and large not a problem if you use it with substances which have a neutral pH, like water. Aluminium becomes dissolvable in an acidic environment. So if you're cooking things which are acidic in aluminium pots, yes, then you might dissolve more out of the aluminium. Best thing to do is just avoid them and use stainless steel, obviously, if you can. But if you can't, yeah. By and large, where the aluminium foil goes black, it's oxidized. From there, aluminium has dissolved out. So usually if you cook something, roast something, and the food comes in contact with the foil and makes it black, probably that patch of food will have a higher concentration of aluminium than areas of that same food that haven't touched the foil, because it's dissolved the aluminium out. Where it's possible, avoid aluminium, but if you're using it once a year, like, I don't know, you're at someone's house and they cooked something in an aluminium pot, don't freak out about it.
So your opinion is that whatever vaccines, let's say myself, I had 30 years ago,
Yeah.
those heavy metals would have been
Yeah. Whatever you would have gotten from the few milliliters of accumulated vaccines you got in your lifetime will be nowhere comparable to the levels you've gotten. For example, if you grew up eating meat, dairy and eggs, you will have gotten way more heavy metals from those than from the vaccines you got as a child. So if you want one of the best long-term solutions to having a low intake of these toxic chemicals, go vegan, eat lots of salads, eat lots of whole grains and the other things I've listed, avoid animal products, and make sure that you live in an area of the world where the water is relatively clean and the air is relatively clean. You don't need to be paranoid. If every now and again you eat something that's a little bit like you're not sure, remember my graphic, as long as you're not repeating it again and again and keeping things in the therapeutic interval, you should be fine. You should be fine. And make sure that if you're combining the foods, you combine them with foods that make bioavailability of these substances lower. Yes?
Teflon.
Sorry? Yeah, Teflon's an interesting discussion because Teflon is a known carcinogen. Teflon is carcinogenic. I haven't read many studies. Unfortunately, I'm so busy. I wish I had time to read more and to study more, but I don't. My principle with Teflon at the moment is, where possible, avoid. Teflon, if it's well cured onto a pot, shouldn't be a problem. The problem is more that people don't take care with Teflon. They use, like on a Teflon frying pan, they use things which scratch the Teflon. Then you get small particles of Teflon ending up in the food. And that can already maybe be a problem. I say maybe because I haven't checked the studies and I can't give you a scientifically undergirded response to that question. Okay, thank you everyone for your time. Hope this was educational and I hope you have a nice afternoon. Take care everyone. Bye. You're very welcome.